I call your attention to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5. We've been exploring some of the questions that Jesus asks during his ministry. Today we find another one. He asks the question, "Who touched me?" Let's talk about it today. Mark chapter 5, beginning at verse 21. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, whose name was Jairus, came to him, and when he saw him, he fell before him. And he begged him repeatedly, my little daughter, is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she might be made well and she might live." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under the way of many physicians. She had spent all she had, and she was no better, but grew worse. She had heard about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." And immediately her hemorrhaging stopped, and she felt it inside of her that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and he said, here's the question, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him. And she told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Don't fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, John, the brother of James. And when they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion. People were weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered the house, he said to them, "Why do you make such a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but only sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went into where the child was. He took her by the hand, and he said to her, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk around. She was 12 years of age. And at this, they were overcome with amazement. And he strictly told them that no one should know this. And he told them to give her something to eat. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, today we are going to look at two miracles. Two miracles in Mark's gospel. We look at two miracles because Mark, when he tells the stories, interweaves them into each other. Mark did that a lot. At least 4 times in his gospel, Mark will begin telling one story. He'll go to a second story, tell the whole story, and then go back to the first story and finish the first story. That is one of Mark's favorite ways of telling a story. You know, I'm glad Mark did that. I'm glad he did that because these two stories would not be as effective if they were not told together. Because comparing and contrasting these two stories tell us so much about Jesus and so much about his mission. I think that's why Mark does it. Because it seems like Mark is saying, hey, you've got to look at both sides of this. You've got to look at both of these stories together to understand Jesus. Well, let's look at the stories. Jesus has just gotten off the boat. All kinds of people want to hear him. They want to be with him. They want to see him. They just want to even get near him. And a religious leader, a Jewish religious leader named Jairus. Jairus, you might want to call him. We don't know exactly how he pronounced his name. But this religious leader who had power, who had all kinds of authority, who had all kinds of influence, sees himself doing something I don't think he ever thought he would do. He comes and he falls before Jesus. Why does he fall before Jesus? His little girl. His little girl's sick, and she's not getting any better. And those of you who are parents, you know you will do just about anything for your children. And it's because he loves his little child that this father comes and he falls before Jesus. Wow. I have a feeling this shocked everyone. I have a feeling nobody ever dreamed this would happen. Because you see, the religious leaders already have been giving Jesus a hard time. Already the religious leaders are jealous. They are already envying his power. They are already threatened by Jesus. Something tells me Jairus was probably one of these exact religious leaders who was intent on persecuting Jesus. I have a feeling Jesus, his disciples, as they stood there that day, thought, now Jesus is really got an opportunity here. And he did. I have a feeling these disciples thought, Jesus, now is the time to say, oh, now you want to call on me? Everywhere I've been going, you've been testing me. You've been trying to trap me. Now you want my help. And Jesus did have an opportunity. But what Jesus does that day, I think took the surprise and to the amazement of all of his disciples, because he says to Jairus, let's go. Let's go. One thing Jesus does in his ministry, one thing Jesus does that seems to irritate everybody, is he loved and he was kind to the wrong people. The religious folks didn't like him because he ate with sinners. The religious folks didn't like him because he would reach out to those with a sordid past. I think here his disciples were aggravated at him because he was reaching out to the folks they didn't care for. He was reaching out to the ones they considered to be their enemy. But here's the truth about Jesus. Jesus reached out to anyone. It didn't matter what their background was. It didn't matter what their actions were. It didn't matter what their past was. Jesus was love. And Jesus reaches out, and Jesus helps, and Jesus shows kindness to all he comes in contact with. Well, as they're going to Jairus' house, Mark interrupts the story to tell us the second story. Jesus is on his way to Jairus' house. Jairus is standing right beside him. I have a feeling they're rushing. The crowd is pressing in on Jesus. And all of a sudden, Jesus stops. And Jesus turns around and Jesus says, "Who touched me?" Now, this is why I think the disciples were a little bit aggravated with Jesus, because he was even going to Jairus' house. Jesus says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples almost get a little smart with him, I think. The disciples say, "Jesus, look at all these people. Jesus, the crowd is all around you. Why are you asking who touched you?" I'll tell you why Jesus was doing it. Because there was a woman in the crowd. There was a woman in the crowd that day who had been suffering for 12 years. She had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. She had spent all of the money she had. She had been to every doctor around. Nobody could help her. But this woman said, "If I can just touch the cloak that he's wearing, just the hem of it, just the very edge of it, if I can just get close enough to touch his clothes, I know I will be made well. I'll be healed." And she does. She does. Notice the comparison and the contrast of these two miracles. Jairus, well-connected. A man. We know his name, Jairus. What was this woman's name? We don't know. Mark doesn't tell us. Mark may not have known. Where was she from? We don't know. All we know is that to Jesus, it did not matter if you were a person of well-connected circles or you were an outcast. To Jesus, it didn't matter if you had influence or not. When Jesus looked at people, he loved them just like they were. Jesus stops and he says, "Who touches me?" And this lady steps forward. What courage it took, I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. This lady had been bleeding for 12 years. That bleeding made her ceremonially unclean. That meant she could not go to the temple. She could not go to the synagogue. She could not worship. She could not come into contact with anyone. And if she did, they became unclean. They became ceremonially unclean. They couldn't go to the temple. They couldn't go to the synagogue for 7 days. The audacity of her to reach up and to touch Jesus. Wow. This woman had some nerve. This woman had some faith. And when Jesus stops and says, "Who touched me?" and she comes up to him and tells him the whole story, I love how Jesus treats her. He could have said, "Woman, what are you doing? You're unclean. I was going to go to the synagogue this afternoon. Now I can't go for 7 days." He could have said, "Woman, who do you think you are?" But what he says to her amazes me. "Daughter," he calls her. "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Now, was she his daughter? No. But something tells me deep inside that was the first time anyone had spoken to this lady with that kind of respect for years. Now Mark goes back to the first story. The lady is healed, and Jesus and Jairus continue their journey back to his house. As they're going, some of his servants come, and they say, "Jairus, it's too late. It's just too late. Your daughter is dead. Don't bother Jesus anymore." Jesus looks over at this father, and he says, "Don't worry. Don't be afraid. Believe." He gets to the house, Jesus does. And there's this huge commotion Everywhere you look, there are people and they're weeping and they're wailing. And Jesus says to them, why are you acting like this? The little girl she's only asleep. Don't worry about it. Don't act like this. Mark tells us they laughed at him. What intrigues me is that Jesus kicks them out of the house. You don't laugh at Jesus. Jesus kicks them all out, and he takes with him Peter, James, and John, and I think Jairus goes, and he goes into the room where this 12-year-old girl is lying. And he says to her, little girl, get up. The Bible says immediately she does. Jesus says to her, or says to those with him, give her something to eat. That's Mark's way of saying this is no ghost. That's Mark's way of saying, hey, she's really alive. They must have been Baptists because he wants to give them something to eat. And I have a feeling back in those days, just like these days, someone had died. There was some fried chicken and potato salad and a casserole or two there. But Jesus tells them something else. He tells them, now don't tell anyone what's happened here. Don't tell anyone what you've seen. Why? You see, Jesus was not going to be a televangelist. Jesus was not going to be someone who was going to go around making a name for himself. He was not going to exploit this little girl or that lady he'd healed. It wasn't about him in his ministry. It was about other people. It was about how Jesus could do work in their lives. Not about gaining fame or prestige for his life. Those are the two stories. Those are the two miracles. And Mark interweaves them perfectly, I think. So what about these two stories intrigue you the most? When I was telling the story, what jumped out at you? I'll tell you what jumped out at me. What jumped out at me was this. It's the way that Jesus addresses the woman in the second story. Daughter, your faith has made you well. And Jesus tenderly tells her, go in peace and be healed of your disease. Now, I said before, was this woman really Jesus' daughter? No, she wasn't. So why did he refer to her as daughter? Well, I think the first story holds the clue to understanding that. Who was the person in need of Jesus' touch in the first story? It was Jairus' daughter. And what did Jairus do for her? He set aside his pride. He set aside protocol to get her the help she needed. This proud and powerful man dropped to his knees in front of Jesus, and he didn't care who saw him. He wanted his daughter to live more than he wanted his reputation and his standing in the community. And he was willing to give up everything for her, and he probably did. On the other hand, the woman who touches Jesus' hem of his garment has no father to plead her case. She was all alone. After 12 years of trying to find a cure, she has no money or even any friends left. No one like Jairus was going to be her advocate. So Jesus looks at her, and he uttered the sweetest words that she had ever heard. Daughter, daughter. How long had it been since anyone had called her that? How long had it been since she felt wanted and loved? How long had it been since anyone had spoke a kind and a hopeful word to her? How long had it been since she felt like anybody cared about her? Daughter, Your faith has made you well. Jesus tenderly tells her, go in peace now and be healed of your disease. What do you think Mark wants us to take away from these two stories? Well, for me, it's this. First of all, be there when your children need you. Love them at their best. Love them at their worst. Like Jairus, put aside pride and protocol when necessary. Walk along with them. Encourage them. Support them. Give them wise counsel. Never give up on them. And at the same time, respond to everyone you meet as if they were a member of your family. Treat everyone with dignity and respect. Walk alongside them so that they will not feel alone, even if you cross paths for only a short period of time. Listen to their story. Speak kind and hopeful words. Offer to pray for them and with them. Because you see, through these two stories, Mark is urging his readers to be on the lookout for the lonely. Mark is saying, be on the lookout for the disenfranchised. He wants his readers to follow Jesus' example. He wants his readers to remember the day that Jesus adopted a stranger into his family. Daughter, your faith has made you well, Jesus tenderly tells her. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. Who needs you to love them that much? Who needs you to say those words, those loving, kind words? You may not can heal them physically, but I bet if you'll treat them with dignity and welcome them into your family like Christ has done for you, I bet you'll change their life. Amen.